The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeff Baldus. I'm the Deputy Director of Death with Dignity-Albany. And along with Bonnie Edelstein, our Director, I'd like to welcome you to today's program. It's nice to see so many of you here. I'm going to ask, before we go into the main part of our program, Amanda Kavanaugh to speak for just a few moments. Amanda is the New York Outreach Coordinator for Compassion and Choices, which is the national organization working in the Medical Aid in Dying initiative. But Amanda also is our advocacy coordinator for Death with Dignity Albany. And I'd like Amanda just to give us a brief update on the state of things as they are now, because we found that for most people attending our meetings, they like to know what's happening and what the current state of affairs is relative to the medical aid in dying legislation and related initiatives in the area. So Amanda, would you please share some information with us?
Thank you so much for being here. The Medical Aid in Dying Act was reintroduced this year, and we made tons of advancements, but unfortunately we weren't able to get it through the Assembly Health Committee, which is the first step of our bill. Some seats changed this year that put us in a difficult space. We worked really hard to get two Democratic legislators to change their no votes to yes. We went as far as getting organizations to contact them, personal friends, other lawmakers. We spent months on this, and unfortunately, we just couldn't get them to budge. Lucky for us, one or two of them could possibly not be on the Assembly Health Committee in 2018, and so we're already beginning to strategize how we can get the right people in those seats so that we can pass that bill. So right now, for 2017 session, we run in a 2-year cycle. There won't be anything else happening in the next few weeks until session ends. You may have heard about the court case that is happening right now in the Court of Appeals for medical aid in dying. That is pending. We'll get the results sometime this summer, and again, we'll have a lot more details about that on our June 26th call. Although medical aid in dying, the act did not get through the legislature during this 6-month session, we have had tons of advancements in the movement in the last 6 months. After a 2-year informational session, the New York Civil Liberties Union has come out in support of the bill. The New York State Public Health Association has officially come out in support. The Hospice and Palliative Care Association of New York has issued a long-standing opposition. They put a memo out to lawmakers each and every year about how they're opposed to this. This is the first year they have not done that. They've been really engaged in our campaign. We've been having a lot of conversations with them, and we're really hopeful that that relationship is going to blossom. The Medical Society of the State of New York also has had a long-standing opposition against any type of medical aid in dying bill. They agreed a few months back that they are going to be surveying all of their members, so we are really looking forward to the results of that survey. We have a physician sign-on letter where any doctor who's supportive signs on. In the last 6 months, we've been able to double the number of physician supporters. When the bill was reintroduced for the first time this year, it had 15 co-sponsors. Now we have 29. And just today, Gallup was released. that said that 73% of Americans from New York to California are supportive of medical aid in dying. So we're really excited for that. We have a lot of plans this summer. We're going to be doing in-district meetings here in Albany as well as across the state. We're going to the state fair again this year for 13 days, and we're really looking forward to getting petition signatures to turn into the governor. And we're going to be working very closely with the Medical Society, trying to do presentations to the physicians, so when they get that survey in their hands, they'll know to check yes. So I'm just going to circle back to that June 26th call. All of this stuff is going to be on that call, plus a lot more. And if you have any questions, I will be around for the entire program.
Thanks, Amanda. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Judith Schwartz, who has joined us today to talk about a very interesting, timely, and difficult topic, and one that is of particular interest to folks who have expressed concern that the medical aid in dying legislation exempts folks who suffer from Alzheimer's disease. And Judy will talk about how this topic, voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, may be incorporated into advanced care directives and potentially address some of those concerns along with others. Judy is the clinical director of End of Life Choices New York, and she is considered an expert on ethical issues relating to self-determination and informed end-of-life decision-making. She is the author of numerous articles, has presented at many conferences and opportunities across the state and the nation, and is considered to be a nationally recognized expert in the field of voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. Judy earned a PhD in nursing research from New York University, an MSN from Lehman College, and an RN from St. Luke's School of Nursing. She has a broad breadth of experience and background to share with us. I think you will find her discussion and conversation today both informative and engaging. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Judith Schwartz.
Hi, thank you.
You are welcome.
So let me know if you can hear me okay, right? Can you? All right, I expect responses. This is not going to be me talking at you. We're going to have a conversation here. So here's what I hope to talk about today. This is the plan. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of End of Life Choices New York. I know all of these different labels of groups are very confusing, and we'll talk about that. Then I'm also going to talk about our mission, End of Life Choices New York, and our efforts to legalize aid in dying. You've heard a little bit about that. And in the meantime, before we have legal aid in dying, we have VSED, voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. So what I'm going to tell you is if you're considering this option or you have loved ones who may be candidates for this, I'm going to tell you what's necessary, what has to be in place for a, quote, successful outcome. And then I'm going to define what I think a successful outcome is, because I think that's important to know. And then after we talk a little bit about that, I'm going to talk about the business of folks with an early diagnosis of Alzheimer's who are terrified of the final stages of Alzheimer's, and they want to know what in the world they can do to avoid that stage. So we'll talk about that. And I have a few case studies. So I'm going to tell you first I'm going to tell you about end-of-life choices. We've been around for over 15 years. We used to be known as Compassion and Choices of New York, and then a couple of years ago there was sort of a parting of the ways, and we became End of Life Choices New York, but we do the same work. We have the same mission, and I've been the clinical director for over 15 years, first for Compassion and Choices of New York, and also for this group. Our mission, the same as Compassion and Choices. is to improve care and expand choice at the end of life. That's what we're about. We're a not-for-profit organization. We provide advocacy, support, education, information for whoever calls us. And I'm the person that answers those phone calls. I've left my cards on the table back there, and the final sheet, the final slide of this has my email address and the phone number that you can call at any time, and I'll get back to you, and we can have a conversation. So, the other thing we do, in addition to responding to individual people that call us, is we collaborate closely with colleagues in hospice and palliative care. Together, we have been able to finally pass some legislation that's a little bit better than the horrible state that it was beforehand. The Family Health Care Decisions Act only took 15 years, but nonetheless, it was passed. The patients, the end-of-life Determination Act, we were involved in helping to pass that. So we work with our colleagues who are trying to improve the opportunity for you folks to be able to make good end-of-life choices for yourself. So about the Consultation Service. We get lots of calls for lots of different reasons. Some of them are fairly straightforward and reasonably easy to answer. People call about advance directives. They want to know which ones to use and how do you get them and where do you download them from and what's the difference between a MOLST, medical orders for life-sustaining treatment, and who should have one of those. And how do you get an out-of-hospital do not resuscitate order? It's a very important item to have. And what if you never want to have to go back to the hospital again? Who do you tell that about? So those are the kinds of conversations we have a lot. And from my perspective, those are pretty easy. Those are pretty straightforward questions to answer. But then we get calls from people who are really sick. Or we get calls from their family members or their close friends or loved ones who say that my grandmother or my uncle has just learned that he has a terminal illness. Then it's a different kind of conversation that we have. I do a pretty extensive intake. Clinically, I want to know what's going on with this person, when they were diagnosed, have they had a second opinion, who have they spoken to? Do they understand what the options that they have in front of them? Have they considered life-prolonging interventions, or are they eligible or enrolled in hospice? Many people think that hospice is a place you go to. Now, I come from New York City. It's a bit different than the way you folks operate out here. But in New York City, just about everybody on hospice stays at home, and hospice comes to them, right? It's a team of experts that provides really, really good symptom management. And you all know when somebody is eligible for hospice care, some doc has made a guesstimate that they probably will die of their disease within the next 6 months. Sadly, in New York State, most people get enrolled in hospice in the last 3 weeks of life, if they're lucky. It's a terrible thing. In any case, so that's one of the first things I do when I'm talking to people who've been told that they're terminally ill, is ask them whether anybody's had a conversation with them about hospice, and are they enrolled in hospice. But we also get calls, I get calls, from people who are living with incurable and progressive diseases. Now, those folks are not, quote, eligible for hospice because who knows when their Parkinson's will finally enter a terminal stage, or, as we've intimated, Alzheimer's, when that will turn. Do you know when the terminal stage of Alzheimer's can occur? Years and years and years after you're first diagnosed. But we'll talk about that later. So the folks that are living with incurable and progressive diseases could still definitely benefit from getting palliative care. Now, do you know what palliative care is? Have you heard of that? It's like hospice in that there's a team of experts that are focused on symptom management. The only goal here is to keep you functioning as well as you can with the best symptom management as possible. But they don't care so much whether you're terminally ill. In fact, you don't have to be terminally ill at all, and you can continue to have life-prolonging measures. The tricky thing with hospice is you have to agree that you're going to stop life-prolonging measures, because hospice pays for everything, right? The government pays for hospice. It's the only good deal we get from the government these days. So that's part of what I do in that initial conversation. I want to know who this person is that's calling. Are they decisionally capable? This is a very important piece of what I need to know about that person right off the bat. Are they able to make informed decisions for themselves? Do they understand the information they're given about a particular medical intervention? Do they understand the consequences of making a decision? And can they make a decision based on the information they're given? And can they remember the decision they made? All of these things are important. So, next, the folks in both of these groups, they want to know how they can control the circumstances and timing of their own death. They're seeking information. Do I need to tell you, is it surprising to know that most people would like to have a magic purple pill that they could just take and go to sleep and not wake up? And sadly, it's my duty to tell many of these people, and they're very disappointed to hear that that doesn't exist. And it would not be legal for anybody to give anybody a lethal dose of medication or a shot. And it's disappointing, you know, they would really like this to just go away. But that's not what we do, right? In the meantime, though, let me tell you a little bit about what we've been doing. You've heard a little bit about it from Amanda. We did have a court case. We finally got to be before the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. And we're now waiting to hear what this court decides. For us, a win will be we get to go back down to the lower court and actually have testimony and a hearing. We didn't get to do that when we first brought the case to the lower court. And I want you to know I'm one of the applicants, one of the people that's trying to get this law changed. I'm a listed person on this lawsuit, I'll have you know. In any case, we're hopeful. This worked in Montana. We're hoping it'll work here. We'll know, as you were told, sometime in the summer, the end of June and July sometime. Meanwhile, I think it's going to be a long time before we pass a law, but I really admire the people that are working hard to make it happen. It's hard to get controversial things through Albany these days, but maybe that'll change, and I do hope it does, because there are many people that could benefit from having a law like this in New York State. And again, in the meantime, until those things happen, we have voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, or VSED, right? V-S-E-D, VSED. For sure, it's nobody's first choice. This is hard. This is a difficult endeavor to engage in. But I can tell you that I know a lot of people who have made this choice and have been successful in doing so. It's one of the options that we talk about. When somebody says to me, I'm done, I want out, I want to finish this disease and this life, and I want to know how I can hasten my death, I need to know what kind of life-prolonging measures they already have in place. Like, gee, do you have an implanted cardiac defibrillator? Because if we turn that puppy off, you're good to go. Literally. There are other things that can be useful to know, like if somebody is an insulin-dependent diabetic, or if they have a pacemaker that is a continuously pacing pacemaker, as opposed to, intermittent. These are all part of the options that they can say, okay, this is an intervention that's no longer benefiting me, and I no longer want this intervention, and then a physician is legally and morally required to turn that off. So we talk about that. Sometimes people are on medications like insulin, as I say, and we can talk about what it would be like to stop that medication. None of this can be done without well-informed medical oversight, and I'm not cavalier about the kind of advice that I give. The other thing that we can talk about is for people who are terminally ill and often enrolled in hospice, if they have very, very difficult to manage symptoms, pain or shortness of breath or other kinds of intractable symptoms, there's something called palliative sedation that can be provided when the usual kinds of palliative measures to relieve distress are not working. Then particular medications are provided, usually intravenously, that put that patient into a coma. And once they're in a coma, obviously they can't eat and drink, right? So they will die secondarily, probably as a result of dehydration or their advanced disease. This is an option usually only for people who are close to death and who are suffering tremendously and they just can't relieve that distress. So again, that's another option that patients need to know about. They need to find out whether their hospice can provide that service or whether they need to get admitted to a palliative care service in a hospital. Usually you can't stay at home and get palliative sedation. You have to go into a hospital. But that's not a bad trade-off sometimes if that's the only way your symptoms can be managed. So, let's see. And then there's always, as I said, VSED. I must tell you that this is not an appropriate option for everything. For everyone, rather. I'm thinking of this lovely 98-year-old woman I went to see yesterday for the first time. And I'm telling you, this woman looks better than I have ever looked. She was magnificent. And although she had many family members who were very concerned about trying to help her, and she had told them repeatedly for weeks and weeks and weeks that she wanted to die and that she was just finished, the fact is that she looked in remarkably good shape. She did not have any diseases. She wasn't taking any medications. I think it was more a case of ennui than actual suffering, although I'm sure she was unhappy. But I had to tell her that this would be a very tough process to stop eating and drinking, and that she would have to assume moral responsibility for her own death. That was not what she wanted, actually. She wanted somebody to take care of this for her. And you know, it's a very human desire, it's a very human request, but I told her that I've been doing this work for a long time, and I've sat at the bedside of many people who've made this choice. And the only people that choose to stop eating and drinking are those whose living day to day is so miserable, they're so unhappy, and their suffering is so unbearable to them that they will make a choice to intentionally hasten their own death by stopping all oral intake. All right? So, successful outcome, right? What needs to be in place for somebody to be successful in this endeavor? They have to have some kind of underlying disease. You know, this is not for people who are having a bad hair day or for, you know, the young who maybe have an eating disorder, although I must say I have never, ever had anybody like that approach me. These are people who are living with disease of one sort or another. And what I tell them are the things that are necessary for a successful outcome. And by a successful outcome, I mean a peaceful, gentle death that's relatively pain-free, that happens within a predictable period of time. And I'll tell you what that is, because it depends on the underlying disease, the body state, and a bunch of other things. But where it starts is with a decisionally capable person who is very, very determined to hasten their own death. That's what's most important, is a decisionally capable person who is determined to control their own dying, to hasten their own death. And then what else has to be in place is that person has to have psychosocial support from family or good friends who will stay with them throughout the process and will remind them if they forget, which they probably will, as they begin to go into organ failure and their thinking gets a little bit skew-iffed. They need somebody to remind them that this was their choice, that they made this choice because they were miserable and suffering, and that the family members and the loved ones want to support that choice. And it can be hard when somebody forgets that they've made this choice, and maybe they say, no, I want a hamburger. So we have conversations with these patients and their family members beforehand, and we talk about, what will you do if grandma says, no, I'm serious, I want a Coke and a hamburger right now? And after grandma's been explained why she made this choice and why she might be a little hungry or a little thirsty, and she still insists that she wants a hamburger and a Coke, what do you do? Exactly. You give her a little bit of whatever it is that she needs in her mouth, right? Whatever she needs, but you don't give her a big, huge Big Mac. You give her a little bite of something, and I'm telling you, it's not the food. People can do without food pretty readily, particularly if they're elderly and they're frail. Usually their appetite isn't much to begin with, and they've only been eating because somebody's been saying, you have to eat to keep your strength up. And when somebody stops saying that, and they listen to their body, they realize they're actually not hungry. But let me tell you, going without fluid can be a whole lot more of a challenge. That's what you die of, is dehydration, not starvation. And that can be really challenging. It can be managed with good, number 2 here, is caregiving help, right? You need to probably hire round-the-clock caregivers as this fast progresses, unless you've got a whole lot of daughters. I hate to sound sexist about it, but it's usually the women that are there at the bedside of somebody who's struggling. This is not rocket science, but it takes somebody that can keep a patient clean, dry, safe, because they're going to be in bed all the time. They're going to be too weak to get out of bed. They're going to need good caregiving support, and in that, I'm talking about oral care. Now, when somebody's got a dry mouth, you have to use all kinds of tricks to make their mouth feel less dry. It's not usually that they're thirsty per se as their mouth feels dry. So you encourage them to rinse their mouth out with cool water and spit out, so long as they can cooperate. You have those swabby things. You have excellent oral care with toothbrushing and mouthwashing, whatever helps their mouth to feel better, feel more refreshed, and of course, lip gloss, and a fine, fine mist that you can spray into the back of the throat. Anything that helps them, plus, in addition, of course, you need access to hospice or palliative medical oversight. Many of the conversations I have with people who want to know about this, when I tell them that they can't do this alone, they go, why not? I've done everything alone. Why do I have to get anybody else involved? This is my business. I don't want anybody else to know. And I say, you can certainly do whatever you want, but the chances of your succeeding by yourself are not great. It's very hard to do. And most people will require small amounts of opiates, liquid morphine, little bits of liquid morphine and a liquid Ativan, which is an anti-anxiety medication, that put that person in a sort of a little bit of a sleepy state, so they're not wide awake and remembering how hungry they are. I had a woman who tried to do this while she was watching the Cooking Network all the time. That didn't go well. This is hard, and you need to be very determined. You also need access to medical oversight, because anybody, as they're getting close to death, whether or not they're fasting, as their body begins to go into organ failure, you can have symptoms of delirium and agitation. They need to be aggressively treated very promptly by people that know what to do with that kind of symptom, which is there's particular drugs that you use that will make those symptoms go away. You don't want somebody to suffer any more than they're already suffering from the disease that they're experiencing. What's the last thing you need? Patience, right? For somebody who's terminally ill and has an underlying disease like cancer, I can pretty much predict how long it's going to take them. And the average, and we know this from some few studies that have been done, is 10 days if you're terminally ill. If you're not terminally ill, and if you have a incurable and progressive disease, it's longer, it's harder. As I say, the length of the fast depends on the underlying disease, how sturdy this person is, what kind of muscle mass they have, whether they have a lot of, I hope not, fluid in their tissues, edema. All of these things make a difference. Somebody who doesn't have a terminal illness, it can take up to 3 weeks of fasting, which is hard to do, and it's a long time. The other thing that can be challenging so let me see. I've already talked about this, right? For the people who are not terminally ill, but those living with an incurable and progressive disease, the challenge can be getting hospice and palliative oversight, because if they don't have a terminal illness, hospice is not going to want to enroll them. And there are many hospices that will not enroll somebody whose only entrance qualification is that they're fasting, that they're intending to hasten their death by stopping eating and drinking. Sometimes you can do a little tap dance around the fact that if granddad starts fasting at home, the family can call hospice after a couple of days and say, you know, I don't know what to do with Grandpa. He's just turned his face to the wall. He's just in bed all the time. He's lost interest in everything. Can you come and help me? Then they probably can come and help you. But it's difficult. It's difficult. If you have a long-time family physician who understands that this is something that their patient wants to do, sometimes they will order the medications that can be administered by family members. It's oral morphine is not complicated. But it takes a lot of upstream planning and a lot of discussion, and it always starts with a very determined patient, right? The thing that I would say for sure is that nobody can be successful on this path unless they're so miserable to begin with that the escape of death is something they really, really look forward to and want. And it's hard, right? So those were the patients that I heard from all the time, the folks who were terminally ill, the people with incurable and progressive diseases. And sometimes people just wanted to know what was out there, what their options were, what they could consider if and when they had a serious problem. And I've got people that I speak to once every year or two, and they say, I'm still doing okay, but, and that's fine, that's great. But now I'm hearing from a new group of patients that I never heard from before. And these are folks that have been diagnosed with an early stage of Alzheimer's disease. Now, as you may know, neurologists are doing a better job of being able to diagnose people at an earlier stage of Alzheimer's, in a preclinical stage sometimes. And people are going to get tested because they have a significant family history, and they're worried about the possibility of this disease affecting them. And neurologists know how to do tests that they can repeat over time, every 6 months or every year or so, and document the beginning signs of memory loss and inability in an executive function that are the hallmark of the beginning stages of this disease. So the folks that I hear from know that they have Alzheimer's. They've been diagnosed, and they are desperate to avoid the final stages. Those are just some factoids that I put out there. The incidence of Alzheimer's increases with age. There's a direct parallel. And as you may know, There are a lot more elderly people around than there used to be, right? And so in 2016, the number of New Yorkers diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, age 65 to 75, was 51,000. From age 75 to 84, 160,000. And then over 85, look at that jump, 180,000. And it's only expected that that's going to increase. The number of people with Alzheimer's are going to increase. So while people retain, so they want to know, what can they do, right? What can I do to avoid the final stages of Alzheimer's? And so I tell them they have two choices. The first is what we've been talking about, stopping eating and drinking while they retain decision-making capacity. And that's the important key. While they have the window of opportunity, which is decision-making capacity, they can decide to hasten their death by stopping all oral intake. The challenge with that is, generally speaking, these are people that are pretty healthy. They don't have other diseases, or at least not the ones that I hear from. And so this is really, really a hard thing to do. It's hard to take active steps to hasten your death and lose perhaps some good time while you're still enjoying life, because you know that decision-making window is closing, and it may close at any time, and you can't make an informed decision. I must say that I have not seen anybody do this yet where they have actually successfully, where they have sort of arbitrarily said, this is the time that I'm going to do this, and I'm going to stop then, stop eating and drinking then, in order to avoid the final stages. I have a couple of cases at the end of this talk, case studies, that will illustrate some of the challenges of this. The alternative that I'm spending quite a lot of time on these days is talking to people about what they can add to their usual advance directive that stipulates that when they lose decision-making capacity as a result of this disease of Alzheimer's, and they also lose the ability to feed themselves, they stipulate in writing that they don't want to be hand-fed. Now, why is that important? Because without writing in a living will that you don't want to be hand-fed, you will indeed be hand-fed until you no longer know what to do with the glop that's put in your mouth. That's actually the very terminal stage of Alzheimer's disease, when you forget how to swallow. You don't know what to do with this stuff that's in your mouth. I will tell you that in addition, there is this little reflex that exists for sometimes years, where when a spoon is brought to the corner of the mouth, it pops open like a baby bird's. The stuff is put in your mouth and you swallow it. That means somebody's standing there at your bedside talking to you and encouraging you, but also putting this spoon in your mouth until you don't know what to do with it, right? And who knows exactly when that's going to be. Now, this hasn't been brought before a judge yet. This is complicated because some people believe that providing food and fluid to a demented elderly person who appears to cooperate in feeding, you know, that reflex, that there is a duty to feed them, just as there is a duty to keep somebody clean and dry and safe. They're a vulnerable elderly person. Do we not have a duty to care for them? And some people say that this is not medical care. This is ordinary care that is obligatory. Now, this will be the next big battle, I think, after we get aid and dying passed, or maybe after we get our court case won. And I'm really looking forward to that case when somebody completes one of my living wills that very, very carefully stipulates both the stage of dementia and what they don't want and what else they need to have, right? They need to have a healthcare agent who understands and will support their wishes. They need to take that document. I think I have a slide that says that. Okay, I've been there. I'm going to stop a minute and say, is this surprising that people want to have this choice? Are you surprised by this? I always assumed that some people would be shocked at this, and maybe they still are. I think young people are more shocked at this, really. But I know from talking to these people that they are terrified, absolutely terrified of what they have usually observed amongst close friends of theirs or family members who have lingered and lingered and lingered and lingered in ways that they find just so undignified and dehumanizing. You do know that the terminal stage of Alzheimer's is defined as somebody who is bedbound. They can't get out of bed, they can't move independently at all. They're generally mute. If they say anything, it's a few words. They don't recognize their loved ones or any of the caregivers, and they're incontinent. For many of the people I talk to, this is a fate worse than death. And this terminal stage can go on for over a year because they're being fed. Now, this is what I think you need to do in addition to completing a very careful addendum added to your living will saying, I do not want to be hand-fed. When and if I reach an advanced stage of Alzheimer's, dementia, and can no longer feed myself, I want to have oral assisted feeding withheld. And then you add that thing. And even though I may appear to cooperate in feeding, that doesn't mean that I've changed my mind. I still don't want to have food offered or any kind of oral intake offered. Now, I can tell you that this is a whole lot easier to do at home, right? If you're at home and you have caregivers who will support this choice, if you have aides that understand that this is a choice that you've made, and I have found in New York City that hospices will honor this kind of a written directive that says a person has thought about this, they've made a very considered decision, they've talked to their primary care physician, I think they should take it to their lawyer, they should show all of their family members, not just the agent. Everybody needs to know, every one of the stakeholders that cares about this person, while they're still decisionally capable, they need to talk about this with their loved ones, with their family, and also, of course, their healthcare agent. And that agent has to be able to stand there and be very aggressive about saying, this is what he wanted. He told me very, very carefully and thoughtfully that this is what he wants. So, I have a couple of cases. The first case is Hannah. And Hannah is 98 years old now. She was diagnosed with Alzheimer's 15 years ago. She has been in diapers for 7 years. She's in a hospital bed, cared for lovingly by round-the-clock aides in the living room of her sun-filled, beautiful New York City apartment. And her daughter, of course, pays for the round-the-clock aides that care for her mom. As I say, each meal takes more than an hour, but the aides are happy to do that. And they stand there and they have wonderful, warm endearments that they speak to her. And let me tell you, Hannah opens her mouth. She apparently loves that glop. I don't know whether she loves it. She opens her mouth and she swallows it without any coughing or choking or sputtering. She's not turning her head away. She's turning her head towards the spoon. And interestingly, after Hannah's husband died, she knew she needed a new advance directive. So she and her daughter, Anne, went to the family attorney and said, you know, we need to draft a new advance directive. And they talked about, Hannah and Anne, about all of the things that Hannah would not want. She wouldn't want to be resuscitated. She certainly didn't want a feeding tube. And there were other things that she said she didn't want if she had a life-threatening disease. But nobody talked about hand feeding or assisted feeding in the event that she developed Alzheimer's. Nobody knew to do that. That was a long time ago. So, okay, this is not working. Okay, there it goes. Oh, wait, I have to go back one. Okay, thank you. So even though Anne knows very well that her mom would be horrified if she could see herself lying in this bed, apparently Anne told me her mom was pretty frugal and was very careful with the buck. She would be horrified if she could see what was happening. And she would say, if she could wake up and look around, that's what you want. You know, as an agent, you want to know, what would the patient want you to do in this situation? And she knows her mom would say, just shoot me now, because this is not a life that she would want to live. She's been in hospice now for over a year, and hospice confirms that while she appears to cooperate, that's my language, they say, while she enjoys eating, is what they say, so long as she's cooperating, she will be fed. She must be fed, as far as hospice is concerned, because there's no indication to the contrary that she wouldn't want to be fed. It doesn't matter what her daughter says. Without any kind of documentation, she will be fed until she finally stops swallowing. And, as I said, Anne hopes she doesn't run out of money first. And then this is Brian and Judith. This is just one of the cases. I'm working with several families. One of a couple who has Alzheimer's, and it's always, not surprisingly, the spouse that calls first. And so I met with Brian and Judith over 2 years ago. He is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. He has written books, and he was absolutely horrified when he found out that he had Alzheimer's disease. So we sat at my dining room table, and he said, okay, what are my choices? What can I do? Because I sure as hell don't want to have to live through the final stages of this disease, nor do I want it for my wife and my 2 kids. So we talked about options and choices, and sadly, he did not have any, life-dependent medications or interventions that we could stop. So we talked about stopping eating and drinking. And he looked at me very seriously and he said, well, what if I just take a gun and kill myself? I said, well, I guess you could do that, but what a horrible thing to do to your family, to your kids, to your wife. So we didn't take that one up again. But we talked about completing this advance directive. So that's what he did, basically, is he went back to his family lawyer with Judith, and they took this advance directive that I had shown? It's a weird word. And they looked through it, and they thought, yes, but we need to think about this. I said, you're absolutely right. You must think about this. This is a big decision to make, and you have to be thoughtful about it. So they proceeded slowly, but in a very thoughtful way. They met with their 2 adult kids. They met with their family lawyer. They spoke to their primary care physician. And then I didn't hear much from them, which often happens. I check in every 6 months or so. How are you doing? What's going on? Anything new to report? That sort of thing. And then I got a call from Judith just telling me that he had moved from their family home into a very high-end senior residence. He was living in, I think, still managing to live in independent living, part of it. And so he was there, and I said, okay, good, all right. And then I heard again from her saying that Brian had recently told her that he thought it was time to begin to fast because he was having trouble remembering his thoughts. By the time he got to the end of a thought, he couldn't remember what the first part of that thought was. So she told me that he had said he felt that it was time to begin thinking about starting to fast. And so I assumed that they were going to be doing it at this long-term care facility or residential place. And so I kicked into high gear like, oh my God, well, we have to hire these people and we have to check with the administrator and we have to do this. She said, no, I'm going to bring him home. He's going to come home to fast. I said, oh, well, that'll be easier. And they, I know, have supportive physicians who will order hospice. So all of that part was fine. But then, as it says here on the slide, a couple of weeks later, I got a call from Judith again, late at night, like 8:30, 9 o'clock, which was very unusual. And she was in tears. She said her sister-in-law, Brian was still in the high-end residential place, her sister-in-law accused her, Judith, the wife, of being a murderer, of encouraging her brother to stop eating and drinking, to die of starvation, to do this terrible thing that Judith was a murderer. So I spent a lot of time on the phone with her, trying to help her process this and reframe it and think about, okay, so what do we do next? How do we help this sister-in-law understand that, in fact, this was not Judith's choice, this was Brian's choice. And while Brian still has the ability to speak to his sister a bit, which he does, that sister needs to spend more time at his bedside. And she also needs to see a copy of this living will that he wrote over a year ago, that he drafted and signed and had it witnessed over a year ago. So that was the first phone call I got from Judith. Then the second one, a couple of weeks later, was about the daughter who happens to be a physician. And she asked the question, well, look, even if Dad slips into advanced dementia, maybe he'll have moments of joy. Maybe he'll have moments of pleasure. So we shouldn't do this. I mean, wouldn't he rather have... And again, it's, wait a second, whose choice is this? Where's the sister? Where is this young physician? Has she spoken to her dad? She needs to. She needs to see this advance directive. I need to call Judith back to see where we are now. I haven't heard from her for about a month. And it may be that Brian is going to lose the ability to put this in place himself. So then it's going to be a harder row for Judith to hoe on her own. She certainly is going to not be able to be successful without support from those kids and the rest of the family. So this is an ongoing saga. It's hard, but it's a place to start, I think. I do believe that a thoughtfully and carefully drafted advance directive that indicates what your wishes are about any kind of life-prolonging intervention, and in my view, food and fluid is a life-prolonging intervention that requires an instrument to be put into your body. A spoon into your mouth is an intervention that you've said you don't want. And I think it should be honored. And we'll see how this unfolds. This is really cutting-edge stuff, folks. There are not very many people talking about this across the country, but there are people talking about this across the country. I have colleagues who are philosophers and lawyers, and we're trying to raise people's consciousness about this. So I will look forward to your questions. I know that there's another little story that we're going to share, and I don't know whether you want to have questions now or hear a little story about stopping eating and drinking. The one thing I want you to know is call me anytime, right? That's my email. I'm a bit of an email junkie for those of you who email. I get back really fast, or call me anytime. Yes?
I just had a
would you like to share just a closing story? Because we often say when we're talking in terms of advocacy and in helping people to change their minds that stories are very important. And Amanda has a story that she would like to share relative to the VSED procedure.
So most of you in this room may or may not have heard my story about the loss of my partner, Chrissy. I share it quite frequently, and it's generally very impactful. However, a story that I don't share as often, I don't know that I've ever shared it outside of close colleagues, is the loss of my dad. He passed away in June of 2014, and Chrissy passed away in February of 2015. So just not something that I generally go back to, but when we're talking about VSED, I think it's important for people to know what it can be like. My dad was diagnosed in 2011 with lung disease. And like most people, he didn't want to accept that he was going to pass away from it. At the end of his life, he was put on hospice. And how many people have had involvement with hospice? Anybody? So I generally, when I talk about Chrissy, I say that hospice really stunk for us. But with my dad, it was the complete opposite. The nurses were wonderful, the aides were wonderful, he loved them. Sometimes I felt like more than he loved us. He fully trusted them in their care. But he was ready to pass away. And so he agreed that he wanted to do VSED, he wanted to stop eating and drinking. And he told my mom, and then they sat us down, me and my brothers, and they explained it to us, what was going to happen. The nurses talked to us, they called me on the phone every day, and we were all in agreement. This was the right thing to do for Dad at this point. We didn't want him to keep suffering. So VSED started. Then my dad became delirious. So there were times where he would wake up in the middle of the night, and hospice isn't around the clock. It was my mom taking care of him. He would sneak in the refrigerator. He would get something to eat. So he would start back at square one again the next day. Or he would wake up in the middle of the afternoon and he would fight and scream and yell at us because he didn't remember that he wanted to stop eating and drinking. And we would remind him, we would talk to him, and sometimes that would work. There was one circumstance where that didn't work. We had to call hospice and get the nurses there immediately because he was trying to cause physical harm to us because he didn't realize, that he had made this decision. And then there were family members, kind of how Judith brought up, that didn't agree with us. They said, why are you doing this to him? If he wants to eat, he's dying, let him eat. They didn't understand that every time we were letting him have something small to eat or a little drink, that we were just prolonging the suffering. And so it was about a month of trying to battle to get him to a comfortable place where he finally slipped into a coma. So I think it's important to know that stopping eating and drinking is definitely an option for people, but it's not just an easy option. You have to be determined. You have to have your family on board. Making a video is a great idea. Making sure that people really know what it takes for somebody, because it's not easy. It is something that's there. I think it's something that a lot of people do. If you're getting hospice care, you tend to slip into a coma. You're taking morphine and all these different types of medication, and most people aren't eating and drinking. But just know the full picture, that it is an option for people. It's a good option for people who have that determination. But make sure your family knows about it and all that good stuff.
Thank you for coming.